Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. I det här avsnittet intervjuar jag legendariske filmhistorikern M Sammon. Kanske mest känd för när han på inspelningsplats levererade sin minutiöst noggranna dokumentation av Ridley Scotts Blade Runner som bidrog till att öka den filmens redan då intensiva kultstatus med sin bok Future Noir. Och den släpptes nu i en tredje utgåva förra året. Men han har jobbat i en eller annan roll på de flesta science fiction, fantasy och skräckfilmer som Hollywood har levererat under 80-talet. Så detta avsnittet blev en total djupdykning i nörderi och Paul sa exakt samma sak till mig när vi hade pratat i 2,5 timme och jag fick dåligt samvete för att jag uppehöll honom. Och det var att han älskade att prata om sånt här. Film var hans liv och oturligt nog så hade jag vid just den tiden inte möjlighet att fortsätta prata en sekund längre än de 2,5 timmarna som vi just hade gått lös på. Men hur som helst, det blir i alla fall ett väldigt saftigt avsnitt den här gången. Så nu kör vi igång. How did your love for fantastic cinema start?
My father was a working man who worked his way up to naval intelligence, counterintelligence. And we grew up in the Philippines and Japan. And it was in Tokyo where my love affair with the fantastique or ciné fantastique, to reference the magazine I used to write for, really began. I was 4 years old, and my earliest memories were of my mother taking me to see a double feature of what I later realized was a low-budget B movie called Riders to the Stars, which had been directed by the B-movie actor Richard Carlson, who also starred in it. And it was a science fiction film about this ridiculous quasi-scientific expedition called Project Scoop, which was about sending off spaceships into the upper atmosphere to scoop up meteors before they entered our atmosphere, because since meteors could become meteorites and hit the Earth and survive the transition through the atmosphere and not burn up, well, obviously meteors were coated with some special substance that we could extract and put on our spacecraft so spacecraft would not burn up. So, the science was a little shaky, to put it mildly. But that was the name of that film. It was called Riders to the Stars. And the other A feature was Them, the giant ant classic.
I have heard that the story of Them is very close to James Cameron's film Aliens.
Not really. No, Them is a classic. Well, briefly. In 1954, Warner Brothers, which released Them, had an unexpected hit the previous year with the Ray Harryhausen film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, or Leagues, whatever it is. I get my leagues and fathoms confused. But here's this low-budget movie about a dinosaur, aquatic dinosaur that is reawakened, and I think it's called the Rhedosaurus, which goes crashing through, at the end of the film, downtown Manhattan through Wall Street, which I always cheered as a teenager, being an anti-capitalist at heart. The unexpected financial success of that black and white low-budget film prompted the same studio to say, well, maybe we should do something along the lines of another giant atomically mutated everyday creature like an ant, and put a lot of money into it. And that became Them. And Them is the story. And it's a very clever narrative and cinematic structure in as it begins as a thriller, as a mystery, as very much a police procedural, where James Whitmore is a highway patrolman who with his partner are out in the desert of Southern California, and they come across a trailer and a car where there had been a family and it's been crushed. And they have no idea what caused it. And they have a strong smell. There's a strong odor of formic acid in the air. And they later find a little girl with a doll who's been really chewed up, and she's completely traumatized. and the only word she can say is them. And as the film progresses, you realize that what's happened is that atomic tests have radiated and caused ordinary ants to grow to giant size. And there's this nest of giant ants out in the desert, and a queen gets away and starts to lay eggs in the sewers of Los Angeles. And if you've ever been to L.A., there's quite a fascinating sewer system there with all those underground tunnels. And at the end of the film, the local contingent of the National Guard and the Army and James Arness, who is a government agent who comes in about maybe 15 minutes into the film, and James Whitmore go into the tunnels underneath Los Angeles to flush out these giant ants and try to kill the queen before the queen gets out again, and spreads these giant ants throughout the world. And it's actually quite straightforwardly, without any tongue-in-cheek.
Well, it does sound like James Cameron's Aliens to me. I mean, with the ants, the beehive theme, and the little girl with the doll head, and the military coming in. Well, I don't know.
There's one or two moments in there that are quite gruesome for an early 1950s audience. For instance, when the protagonist discovered the giant ant's nest in the desert at the beginning of the film, one of them comes up and drops a human rib cage, a picked clean human rib cage out on like it's throwing out the trash. Now that's nothing for a contemporary 21st century horror or science fiction audience. But back then, that was very transgressive. You just didn't show things like that. So this film made a huge impact on me. When you're that age, I don't care in what culture you are, but particularly if you go to something like a motion picture, you're like a blank slate. You have no sense of perspective or scale or experience. And I thought I was watching a documentary, and so I found that very tense and very frightening. But then Riders to the Stars, this little tiny B movie, had a scene which terrified me and traumatized me as a child. And one of these spacecraft that went up in Project Scoop to retrieve one of these meteors accidentally hit one and blows up. And the other surviving spacecraft is using a World War II submarine periscope as their outward, their viewing device to see outside the ship to see what happened. And a astronaut floats by this viewing device, and his visor has blown open, and he's been exposed to outer space. And all that's in the helmet is a skull. And that, again, a cheesy effect, which would not do anything but, probably make most modern audiences kind of chuckle and disdain, in 1954 to a 4-year-old was absolutely terrifying. I screamed, I jumped up. This is all a true story. I ran out of the theater, and we were in Tokyo at this point. And my mother was like stunned, and where did my son go? And the movie's still running, and she runs up trying to find me, and I've disappeared on the streets of Tokyo. So now my mom's traumatized. Well, she spent hours trying to find me. As it transpired, very much like Blade Runner. It's interestingly enough, I never thought about this. But in Blade Runner, when Deckard is out on the streets trying to track down Zora, and eventually winds up at Taffy Lewis's Snake Pit Club, he stops for directions at a street cop. And if you'll notice, there are shots in Anemoid Row as well where the policemen have separate like little police boxes, where there's one policeman in a box literally on the street, which is sort of a two-way communication station, but also a way of street people just accessing law enforcement. Well, the same thing was going on in Tokyo in the early 50s. There were, every few blocks, there would be like a police box where one or two policemen would be in these upright, very much like the Doctor Who call boxes. It turned out that I had literally run out to the street and started screaming, and one of these policemen saw me and called to me, and I've this is all secondhand, but apparently I wrapped my arms around this guy and started crying and started babbling nonsense, and they fed me ice cream. And they brought me in, and I was sitting there just having a great time when my mom finally tracked me down eating an ice cream. So all of that is a very long, involved way of saying that at a very early age, I had this extreme emotional reaction to very early forms of commercial horror and science fiction cinema. Now, I've often wondered if I had seen Singing in the Rain first, if I would instead have this passion for Gene Kelly musicals. I don't know. But there you are. That's where it started.
Okay, so jumping ahead to the late 60s, when you first saw Stanley Kubrick's 2001, and how did you get into the film business?
I went to a private university in San Diego. I also very heartily partook of the hedonistic 60s. I was just good fortune to be 18 years old in 1968 and going from high school to college. And that was sex and drugs and rock and roll. And I very cheerfully threw myself into all that. During the summer at this private school I went, a very enterprising English teacher who was also a part of the then burgeoning film culture invited a producer called David Wolper down to my university to speak. I was talking to Wolper afterwards, and already at that point I was a rabid film buff. And he said, he said, "You're a little bit unusual. I should hook you up with someone named Douglas Trumbull." And I said, I know who Douglas Trumbull is. He did the slit scan for 2001. Now, understand, this is only 2 years after 2001's initial release, so I suppose that my knowledge and reaction was a bit unusual for that period. He goes, well, you seem to know your stuff. He says, I liked what I just did. Let me invite Doug down here to do the same thing, and then I will give him your name, and if you come to the little talk he does, perhaps you can talk to each other. Well, as it transpired, Trumbull was about ready to start his directorial debut, a film called Silent Running. Being the opportunistic little weasel that I am, after his talk, I said, David Wolper said that I should talk to you. And he goes, yeah, I remember you. And he goes, well, what would you like to do? And I said, I read all these magazines, and maybe I can do an interview about this movie you're going to do. And I'd never interviewed a Hollywood person before, but I certainly knew the format. Trumbull said, well, if you come up to Los Angeles, we're going to start shooting on this decommissioned aircraft carrier. And if I can't pay you anything, now this is my introduction to the film business. Now I would know better. But I was essentially hired at a level below a production assistant, if that's possible. PAs being, the most overworked and least paid people of anyone on any show. But fortuitously, one of my jobs was to help suit up these bilateral amputees who were the human actors inside of the small robots that were called Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So here I am on a decommissioned aircraft carrier in San Pedro in California in the harbor. Bruce Stern is walking around, and of course I recognize Bruce Stern from all the films he'd done, mostly the biker movies at that point, and of things like Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, and the Zante Misfits from Outer Limits. And I'm sitting there putting people with no legs into robot costumes. And I'm thinking, I'm 20 years old. I think, wow, this is pretty cool. And from those initial contacts, I sort of kind of wove in and out in a very small level for the next few years. But by, I think it was 78, I was writing to support I and my wife. I had finally gotten serious about writing as a journalist, and I was a machine, man. I was cranking out, you name a market, I was doing it. I was writing for the American Cinematographer, I was writing for the Los Angeles Times, I was writing for Cinefantastique. I became, I guess, one of their star journalists, and I was doing a lot of cover stories for them. And one of them was going to be The Black Hole, the Disney big budget film. It was their first PG-rated movie, and also their first serious live-action futuristic science fiction film. I mean, they obviously had done 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is a proto-science fiction film, but nothing like what they were going to do with the black hole. Alas, they didn't have a script for the black hole, which really shows. I was there while they were making it. I was a huge, as I said earlier, literary science fiction fan, and my first Philip K. Dick story that I had read was The Father Thing when I was 9 years old, and it was, I think, in Galaxy magazine. I can't remember, but it was in one of the science fiction pulps.
That's that Invasion of the Body Snatchers-like scenario with the alien insect.
It is. It is, yes, and it's kind of in the terms of Dick's overall literary output, kind of an outlier. It's not all that representative of the tone of his other things, because in essence, The Father Thing is an out-and-out horror story. I mean, it's the closest to a horror story that Dick wrote. And yes, you're absolutely right that it's like a body snatcher, but although it has that similarity, I don't really think it was in any way, shape, or form in Dick's mind a ripoff. I think what he was doing was he came up with a very dark idea about the ultimate fear of your parents not being your parents. And Dick also had a very difficult childhood. His father and mother separated when he was quite young, and he was raised by his mother, and his mother was very withholding of affection. And he didn't see much of his father. So I think there were some personal issues being worked out. And also, the protagonists of that particular story are children. And that's not something that you usually see in Dick. Usually in Dick, it's street-level people who are neurotic or, all too fallible and all too ordinary. But this was kids on a dark night with a very bizarre insect, you're right. And the image that always got me is when the kids find the skin of the real father, which has been pushed into cardboard boxes or a barrel in the garage, and they lay it out, and it's like the crinkly, dried out husk of a snake. And I always thought that was just a horrific image. Anyway, so I had been impressed by Dick at 9 years old. I read that. And I started to seek out anything that said Philip K. Dick. So by the time I actually met Phil for the first time in 1973 at a lecture he gave at Cal State Fullerton, and he did a lot of reading from his material. He was also kind of, I remember, being all over the place, and he seemed to be unhappy. And I later learned that was the same year he tried to commit suicide. He had a lot of personal issues at that time, and he was just dreadfully unhappy. But I hung around after the thing and introduced myself, and he said, how do you know me? And I said, The Father Thing. And he laughed, and he said, that is an incredibly strange fucking thing this is a quote, that is an incredibly strange fucking introduction. And we both laughed. Phil had a marvelous sense of humor. He's been deified and mystified and kind of turned into this three-eyed extraterrestrial, semi-psychotic guy who was in touch with the music of the spheres. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was a very down-to-earth, kind, ordinary, funny, flawed, but extremely warm guy. A very nice man. And anyway, our paths then started to cross both socially and professionally. And by the time Blade Runner came around, I had already been sort of a known commodity in the film reporting circles, both professionally and on the level of, say, Cinefantastique. And I had been tracking the various attempts to adapt to Android's Dream of Electric Sheep through the other tries that didn't happen. And then when this one was going to look like it was actually going to fly with Ridley Scott, I lobbied both Omni Magazine and CFQ to be an active journalistic reporter on what was going on. And for CFQ, I said, I want to do one of these in-depth everything type of articles. And they said, well, if you can do it, go ahead. And so I called up Phil first. And Phil was livid. He had read some of the early drafts that Hampton Fancher had done, and he thought they were terrible. And he didn't want to have anything to do with Blade Runner. And so I backed off, and I just said, well, okay, well, I'll get to you later. I went to the Blade Runner production offices, where really were just a few people in the art department. Sid Mead had done maybe 4 or 5 pre-production paintings, and they were still working on the script. Ridley Scott literally had just been hired. And I went in and I talked to Michael Dealey, the producer. He said, who are you and why are you here? And I kind of tossed a bunch of stuff that I had written on his desk, and I said, that's me. And I said, I know about this guy, and I know about what you want to do, and I know you from when you were working earlier films you'd done, like The Man Who Fell to Earth and, The White Bus by Lindsay Anderson. And I knew Michael's history, and of course he had just won an Oscar for The Deer Hunter. And I said, in Ridley Scott, I saw The Duelist back in 1977. And I remember Michael laughed, and he said, you and 2 other people. And so anyway, he introduced me to Ridley, and Ridley and I talked for 3 hours that first time. And it wasn't an interview, and it wasn't about Blade Runner. It was about everything but Blade Runner. So Ridley and I had hit it off. I got Ridley right away. I saw someone who was incredibly ambitious, driven, extremely focused, and monumentally talented. And I'm not just blowing Hollywood gas here, because I have a tendency to shoot myself in my foot sometimes by being too candid. But Ridley and I just kind of got each other right away. I just got him. And so I got a letter a couple of days later from Michael Dealey with the official Brighton Productions, which it was called at the time, letterhead, that said, anything you want to do, just don't get in the way. And we have you 100%. And so that's what started it all. So there's the beginnings of the Blade Runner thing.
The time you met Phil Dick was around the time that Hampton Fancher met him to discuss optioning his book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And they didn't get along, and Hampton thought Phil was crazy.
Phil had actually had dealings with Hollywood before. Well, I say Hollywood, but he had done, I think it was a Tales of Tomorrow episode, which was an early science fiction anthology show of the 50s. And he had had a couple of radio adaptations done of his work. So he had some little dealings with what we would broadly call show business. But Phil just hated Hollywood. He didn't like Hollywood culture. He didn't like the shallowness, the duplicity, the backstabbing, the inauthenticity of it. Because let's face it, I mean, one of Phil's ongoing artistic obsessions was, what is the authentic human? And he found Hollywood to be very inauthentic. And so I think he saw Hampton as just another Hollywood kind of guy, a Hollywood hustler. And so in a sense, he kind of blew him off and he played with him. Now, Phil saw me as a fellow lover of literature and someone who was familiar with genre, but also, to a certain extent, a fan, not of Phil, but of his writing. And I think he saw Hampton as someone who was trying to, run a scam on him so he could get a cheap, option and then go off and make it into his own thing. And the thing that Phil did not know, and I kept telling him about Hampton at that point, having met Hampton as the film progressed, I said, Phil, you got Hampton all wrong. Hampton is very well versed in literature. And I'm talking about world-class literature. I mean, this is a guy that's reading Burroughs all the time and reading, Dos Passos and, reading whoever, Cortázar. And he really knows fiction. And he knows the whole, and Nabokov is his favorite author, and he's not a superficial guy. Well, yeah, but he's got all these Hollywood girlfriends, and he's a pretty boy, and and so there was just a built-in flinch reaction. There was a distrust, and so I think that's the reason why initially they had this problem. But as it progressed, it being Blade Runner, and Phil started to he called me his Blade Runner spy, because I would talk to him every now and then, call him on the phone, and I kept saying, you've got an offer to go up there to visit the set. You should see these sets. They're fucking amazing, Phil, and they're doing right by your book. No, it's not a line-by-line transcription of your novel, but the spirit is very close to it, and it's a serious film. It's not some kind of like silly pastiche. And no, they're going to screw it up. And it wasn't until he finally saw the famous screening where he went to Doug Trumbull's facility in Maxella Street, and saw about the first 10 minutes of the movie with his then girlfriend, and that his visual senses got so stimulated by what he was seeing. He was just floored by what he had seen and the approach that had been taken. But also, I had been telling him good things about what they were doing, and a guy named Jeff Walker, who was the genre publicist on that particular film, and went on to do quite a few major projects in terms of bringing major films to things like the San Diego Comic Convention. Jeff Walker and I, between the two of us, we were the ones that were kind of the cheerleaders for this project and the conduit to Phil, and he trusted our opinion. And we kept saying, it's not what you think. It's not what you think. It's not what you think. And towards the end, just before Phil passed, unfortunately, a few months before Blade Runner came out, he became an enthusiastic supporter of the movie. He did a complete 180. One of the last things he told me on the last telephone conversations I had with him, which incidentally are on the special edition DVDs. I don't know if you've heard the telephone interviews segments that okay. Incidentally, I edited those myself. I just threw them up on my laptop, and I pulled all of my questions out and stitched them together so that you would have a certain flow over a period of the varying talks I did, because the talks I did with Phil were much longer. But that I think the entire segment on the DVDs is about a half an hour. But Phil, you can hear him changing his attitude as it goes down the line. And so he went from thinking that he was going to get a big paycheck and not much else. He was thrilled about it. I mean, he got over $300,000. And that was an enormous amount of money back then, especially for someone like Phil, who had really up to that point was on the ragged edge of poverty. And that was his first big sale. And then he dies, So it was strange. But I think that's why, he and Hampton did not get along, because, again, Phil had to a certain extent, realistic perception of the Hollywood process. But I don't think Phil realized that this was an exception to the rule. And we're talking about an exception to the rule 36 years later. So Blade Runner was one of those fortuitous lightning in a bottle moments.
Can you talk about watching Ridley Scott work on the Blade Runner set? An
unbelievable talent for on-set improvisation. And I don't mean with performance, although he was generous. I don't think Ridley was I say this in Future Noir, and others say it as well, but I don't think he was as comfortable around performers then as he is now. So he had a tendency to let them do. He cast with a very acute eye, and I think he was at that point more of the mindset that I hired you because I knew you could do this, so go do it. Which is one of the reasons why he and Harrison Ford clashed, because Harrison wanted to have a dialogue go back and forth. And Ridley was off either up on a crane looking down through a Panavision camera, or he was off in a video village set up in a little tent looking in a monitor into the video feed, not on set. And that just drove Harry crazy. But what I saw was an absolute mastery, a complete confidence, not an arrogance. And in fact, when we first started, well, not we, but when he first started shooting, he was actually rather jolly. And then he ran into this attitude from his crew. And of course, the famous story of the tandem producers, Bud and Jerry Perenchio, being just the wrong people to be the underwriters on this picture. Ridley's mood soured. Let's just say that his displeasure came out in sarcasm and in volume. And I could see it happen because I had the luxury of objectivity. I was there all the time. I saw Ridley virtually, in many respects, direct that entire picture. And I certainly was around for every direction that he gave during the special effects phase. And he was just as hands-on during that as he had been during production. But I recall the very first day when it's a famous story when he walked onto the Tyrell office set and he said, "Looks great, you got the columns upside down, put them up the right way." And he puffed on a cigar and he walked off, and everyone looked at each other because they were ready to go. And they said, "What the hell are we going to do?" Because this is a major reset. They had to, those barley columns that are in Tyrell's office were massive, and they were upside down. And he was right, and he caught it right away. And this was my first exposure to Irvin Kershner, who I worked with on RoboCop 2. And I was actually the computer graphics supervisor on that, as well as the uncredited publicist. And I have a couple of scenes in there. I'm actually an actor in that film. Irv Kershner had this facility, as well as Paul Verhoeven. It's interesting. The A-list, the best of the A-list guys can look at a set and look at something of such complexity and find, just in the one scan, they can automatically pick out that one detail that's incorrect, or that one 10K light that is just slightly off axis, or that one gel that isn't on and should be. I mean, they immediately catch it, and that's just their visual field. And so they also have to deal with the dramatic field, the narrative field. Is it going to cut together? The lenses they're going to use. I mean, it's just this never-ending process. And Ridley, when I first watched him work, I remember thinking, Jesus, I have never seen anyone who knows all aspects as well as this man. It became later known to me that Ridley's favorite two directors were Stanley Kubrick and David Lean. And I think it then kind of a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, Ridley has really studied these two men. He studied Lean's epic scope, and he has studied Kubrick's obsessive attention to detail and to technique. And so I wasn't able to verbalize that at the time, but I was watching it. And Ridley could be very gentle with the actors. I remember he and Joe Turkel, who he had directed, of course, twice before, in The Killing and Paths of Glory, he and Ridley got along just fine. No problem. Joe came out and did his thing, and, Joe was going through a very difficult period then. His father was dying. His parents were living with Joe in this tiny apartment, and Joe was dealing with that, and he was having a hard time remembering his lines, so they had to put up cue cards with the lines up. And Ridley was good with that. No problem. And on the other hand, Sean Young, who was very young and very inexperienced, was not, and in essence was completely a complete virgin in the terms of the pressures that she suddenly found herself in. She was like in a top-of-the-line production with the best people in the business and expected to bring her best game, and yet she had not learned the handbook yet. No one gives you a handbook in Hollywood. There are all these unwritten protocols that you had better get involved in and learn very quickly, or you're going to just get swamped. And she was way out of her depth. And so in the midst of that, Ridley, through varying methods, not all of them the kindest, but was able to coax what I think is her best performance at a very early age. And so Ridley, I was always fascinated. Now, he became a bit of a screamer. The crew started to turn against him because he was relentless in his perfection. He would do take after take. He would spend hours and hours and hours setting up, the lighting that you see in Blade Runner, particularly back in the pre-digital area, time period. Now you do all this, digital intermediate after the film has been shot, where you can go in and sit down in software and change everything from the lighting you can change everything in the computer after you shoot it. But back then you had to get it. And those shots, that lighting takes forever to set up. That's not something that you just do. And so the crew that he was working with, which incidentally were some of the best people in Hollywood, people behind the scenes that aren't as well known as, say, Larry Paul or David Snyder or Sid Mead or Vangelis or Jordan Cronenweth. Those are the big names. But you had a number of other names. Some of the first ADs were some of the best ones that they had out there. Best costume, wardrobe. I mean, they were all the best, but the British people understood how Ridley worked. The American crew didn't get him at all, and the American crew were a bunch of cynical guys who had just, this was just another job to them. Well, it wasn't just another job to Ridley, and so there were these sensibilities that were clashing. And so as I watched Ridley sour, he became more it was a more difficult period for everyone. And I could see it in him because I'd met him long time prior to the film. And I'd gone through prep with him. And I'd seen the same obsession to detail. But at the same time, I saw this personal shift happening. And instead of going under, as many directors and filmmakers would have, because it was a very, very tough production, not only psychologically, but physically. There were 55 nights of shooting, night shoots, and those are tough. And all of the egos and the clashes and the feuds, and yet Ridley would get up every single morning and bring his game. And I remember at the end of that shoot having this tremendous admiration, not, again, some superficial, shallow Hollywood suck-up that I'm saying to get me my next job. I remember just like being truly impressed. My God, this guy he's like a machine. He's able to get up, and he's getting it from all sides. And yet every day he comes and he does better than the day before. So that was my initial reaction. And I've never changed. Now, he has changed. Techniques have changed. Technology has changed. He's learned to do more multiple camera setups. He's learned a different way of acting with performers. Of interacting with performers. And he's gotten. I won't say more mellow, but he is. He's mellowed quite a bit. And the big change I saw was at the time of Thelma and Louise. That, I think, signified a huge shift in how he did films. And a lot of that had to do with Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis, who actually sat down with him and said, look, this is where we think you're not living up to your potential with performers. And this is what we think you should do. and that's pretty strong, but they were at the height of, they were many times the star. Let's put it this way. If you're a studio and you've got a big budget A film or a small budget A film, and you have the biggest names of performers in your film, who are you going to fire first? Are you going to fire the director, or are you going to fire the star? So the star always has more power, right? And so the star sat down and in their own way, to a certain degree, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but they were able to tap into the feminine side of Ridley. And after Thelma and Louise, it was interesting how he worked. He kind of loosened up. He kind of relaxed a bit, and he found other ways of doing things. And it's an interesting, and this is purely a personal observation on my part, but I think that there was a tidal shift in the way that he approached filmmaking from that point onwards. But at Blade Runner, he had a lot to prove. Warner Brothers was expecting another Star Wars. Instead, they get this proto-noir, that is the most it's like, the ultimate death movie. As dark as they come, and that came as a shock. So it was a very unusual, unique, and as time has proven, extraordinary project. And I was fortunate enough to be there the entire time. 2049 isn't Blade Runner insofar that I think that 2049 could have used a little more crazy It wasn't as lunatic or just weird as Blade Runner was. Because let's face it, part of Blade Runner's appeal is its lunacy. It has a certain touch of just craziness to it. That was missing in 2049.
Have you read Hampton's original script for Blade Runner 2049?
Oh yes. Oh yeah.
Because I've heard him say that his original script was pretty crazy and mad, exactly what you're describing.
Yes, and that's how Hampton is. I mean, that's what Hampton likes, and you can, I think, easily see in 2049 Michael Green's contribution and Hampton's. But what's interesting is that much of 2049's spine is Ridley. I mean, Ridley did not just throw out, a general idea. Well, they mate and they have a kid, and the next act continues. There was much more to what Ridley had been thinking about Blade Runner sequel for a long time, and one of the things that it's more well known now among people who study such things or actually watch the supplements on that vanishing breed of home entertainment called DVD and Blu-ray. Everything is streaming now, of course, or YouTube clips. That good directors are often good writers, and they will sit with the writer, and the good ones will actually enhance a screenplay, and will actually come in with their own ideas about structure and character and narrative, and actually enhance it. And it's something that a lot of people don't really understand. The good ones do this. Paul Verhoeven's a great example of that. He's very very precise and very knowledgeable about story. Ridley's probably his weakest. I don't know, weak is too strong a term, but let's just say that his eye is stronger than his structural sense in certain areas. However, with the Blade Runner sequel, a lot of that is Ridley. And, that's a lot of Ridley and Hampton sitting around, over bottles of wine and, arguing over a 2-week period and, Ridley already having it in place. And, and Ridley was already thinking of Ryan Gosling, and so was Hampton. And, that was something that neither one of them knew the other one was thinking of. So, it's interesting. Ridley had a lot to do with that story, and he doesn't get credit for it. But I think Ridley is also, frankly, Ridley told me that the reason why he went with Alien Covenant as opposed to Blade Runner was simply scheduling. Blade Runner, he felt, was not coming together quickly enough, BR 2049, and Ridley's schedule is always inked in years ahead. He's always got 87 balls in the air, and he's painting them at the same time while they're in mid-flight. And he just felt that the Blade Runner deal, because of the complications of the rights, was not coming together in a proper period, and he actually really wanted to direct that movie. He, I think, feels a certain degree of sadness that he wasn't able to do that. He went with Alien because it was the deal came together, and it was all going to happen. And Blade Runner, he wasn't sure it was going to happen. And I know he does. He's told me, flat out. He says, "I wish I had had a chance to do Blade Runner." And he means that sincerely. Interesting. It would have been, I think, obviously a different film, but who knows? But I think Denis did. Good Lord! I mean, I can't. I remember the first time I saw it. I saw it at the cast and crew screening for BR 2049, a few days before it was released theatrically, and I remember sitting there going, "Oh my, this isn't what I expected at all,"
When I talked to Hampton, I asked him about Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire reference in 2049, and he said he wished it was his idea, and it wasn't. I was so surprised. My question is, do you know whose idea this was? Was it Michael Green, the other writer? Was it the director or Ridley? Whose idea was this?
Let me put it this way. I have heard conflicting thoughts on that. I've heard it was Denis, and I've heard it was Ryan Gosling. So I'm going to go with Denis. I can't say that authoritatively, or rather, let me put it this way. At this point, it might be premature for me to express what I think is the true story, and that may seem like I'm trying to dodge it, and maybe I am a bit. But let's just say that I'm thinking Denis.
I'm a huge Hampton Fancher fan, and Hampton's been on the show twice now. And could you talk about the first time you met Hampton?
It was, I think he was during a story conference that they were doing when he was out in Los Angeles. When this was, it must have been 1980 sometime, because the initial, once Ridley came on, they had endless rewrites. And I think it was probably, say, around mid-1980, something like that. And then, of course, we spoke on the telephone a number of times. But it was more of, at that point, it was more of I think I briefly interviewed him to get some things fleshed out for the origins of the project and what happened while it was going on. But it was years later that we really drilled down. But we first met each other around 1980. And I remember thinking that he was a bit eccentric, a nice guy. I liked him. Smart as a whip, also someone who had been around, also an interesting, and this is going to probably get me, if you guys get letters or the equivalent of, but he was a chick magnet. He just, I remember he seemed to have effortlessly some of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen around him. And it certainly wasn't because he was wealthy. I think it was because he has a poetic soul, and he's the genuine article, and I think he is very authentically emotional, and he's an interesting guy. He's got a lot of different facets to him. He's certainly not a simplistic, narcissistic leading man. Far from it. And let's not forget that by the time he got around to writing Blade Runner, the original, and the second film, he had been in the business for a long time at the receiving end of a very sharp stick, because actors take a lot of shit. And it is not an easy job. It is one of the most difficult jobs in Hollywood, and I don't think people understand being a performer. It's not an easy row to hoe, as they used to say. So he had done all of these bit parts in television, and sometimes he was usually like the second cowboy from the right that gets shot halfway through the show, or the rapist, or his looks are he's a good-looking guy, but they're slightly off the classic leading man mold. So he had also been with Troy Donahue in a couple of teen movies, romances, and in the big Hollywood system. And so he'd been at the party for some time. So having said all that, I didn't find any pretense. I found him very approachable, very amiable, very down to earth, very candid. He didn't hold back, and also an extremely talented guy. And he had a unique voice. I remember reading the first drafts that he was doing on Blade Runner and thinking, "Wow, this is nuts!" I love this stuff. I mean, for instance, in the original scripts in Chu's lab, as the movie Blade Runner now shows, when Leon is putting the eyeballs onto the shoulders of Hannibal Chu, the genetic eye specialist, he's just like torturing him by just dropping these eyeballs. Well, in the original script, he was like Leon was smashing fish tanks filled with these eyeballs that were bouncing around the lab like frozen ping pong balls. And so I remember just images like that, saying, "Oh, this is good stuff." And I was amused by the outrageous imagination involved. So, Hampton, that's my reaction to Hampton. I like him, and Hampton is solid. He's a guy who has got you back. He's a good man.
What always mystified me was when I talked to Hampton Fancher, he had a lot of stories from the first Blade Runner, from the production of the first Blade Runner, but on the second one, he had hardly none. I have no idea, and he seemed to almost dodge questions.
Oh, it's because of non-disclosure agreements. It's a simple, there was an edict handed down very early on that picture that there was going to be no advance publicity. that no one was going to spill any secrets, that no one was going to talk about what they did on the film unless it was officially signed off on by the production company. And that was Alcon Entertainment. So Hampton is just essentially, and this is simply, Hampton, if I'm wrong, I apologize. And I hope I don't get you in trouble, because I'm certainly not trying to. But I think he's just honoring what they call a non-disclosure agreement. That's something which I'm sure you're aware of, but for those listeners who are not, this has become a more standard and rather frightening legal document that one signs that says, by agreeing to work on this, I also agree to keep my mouth shut and not talk about it. And so that's why there was so little advance publicity on it, because everyone signed NDAs. That was their publicity. That was their marketing approach. Now, I never signed an NDA. And I was never under any obligation, legally or otherwise, to be quiet. And yet, I was probably the most tight-lipped of anyone on that production, because I knew, and I never reveal my sources, but I knew quite a bit about BR 2049 before it even hit the camera, before it even hit the stage. And I never said anything about it. And in fact, I waited until the third revised edition of Future Noir to even mention what I did know. And that, of course, came out just a couple of weeks before the film did. So, you know, I mean, that's the way I operate. I'm not a kiss and tell kind of guy.
Well, I mean, the only book that's been out on Blade Runner 2049, that book, The Art and Soul of Blade Runner 2049, was written by Denis Villeneuve's wife.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, well, very much so. Yeah, I think that's what I was alluding to before when I was talking about the non-disclosure agreements.
Well, you know, as much as I love Blade Runner 2049, if you have to go back and see what was better in the original, what was better in the original, according to me, was that Ridley made that film so beautiful. It's a dark, pessimistic view of the future, but yet in there with the lights and the rain and the beautiful photography and the music by Vangelis, he made all of these horrible things beautiful. And Blade Runner 2049 is, as Denis himself says, full of just brutality and darkness.
Ridley was able to find the allure in decay. The sequel is essentially what you see is what you get. One of the things I find fascinating about the sequel is how again, Hampton and Denis and, Ryan Gosling is just terrific in that movie. And a lot of people I've talked to said, oh, you know, he's boring. He doesn't do anything. And I say, excuse me, did we see the same movie? You know, do you not understand small scale? You know, do you not understand, like minimalism? You know, because like what I find Gosling is just so in tune with that material, and it is such a sad motion picture, and it is brutal. I mean, there's the difference. They went for more of a documentary look, the brutalism of the communist era, which of course they've talked about at length. How a lot of that picture looks like it could have been shot in Moscow, in the 1970s and the 1980s, with the just overwhelming, crushing, soulless architecture, the stuff that is more fascistic than pop art, like Ridley went. I mean, Ridley went in the direction of Flash. And Denis went in the direction of, if Blade Runner's signature color is neon, then BR 2049's signature color is ash gray, So in many ways they mirror each other. But yeah, what's also funny to me is that people tell me that they think that the original Blade Runner is kind of slow and kind of boring, but I like this Blade Runner 2049. And I go, oh, no, wait a minute. You don't think Blade Runner 2049 is slow? I mean, because I find it immersive and hypnotic, but you know what I mean. It is not exactly a Star Wars movie or, a Mission Impossible. Well, what I think is the true accomplishment of both films is that they're both very personal projects that were done on Hollywood budgets. I saw BR 2049 numerous times on its initial release, and I went and saw it in IMAX. with a friend of mine who is a producer, a well-known producer. He's one of my best friends. I've known him for, almost 40 years now. And we go to the movies all the time together. It's one of the things we do. And I had already seen it. And he goes, don't tell me anything about it. Don't tell me anything. I said, don't worry, I won't. I said, but I just want, when the lights come up, tell me what you think. And he turned to me and he goes, what fool signed off on this movie? Now, you have to understand my friend's sense of humor. He was being droll. What he was saying was, how did anyone convince a major studio to pony up depending on who you believe, $155 to $190 million to make this particular movie, you know? And because it is so out of the mainstream.
Well, lucky for us, somebody put up the money, and we got this masterpiece now.
Oh, absolutely. Every now and then one slips, under the fence. That's the way it's always been.
Well, there's hardly anything behind the scenes from the new Blade Runner out there. Well, I just hope that we don't have to wait 25 years before we get a massive documentary like the one on the first Blade Runner, the 3-hour Blade Runner documentary made by Charles Lasurica.
I think honestly, I think there will be. I think there will be. It's just going to be a matter of time. In fact, there are already projects in the works that are going to continue the Blade Runner expansion, and that will be through Alcon, and that was announced in Variety. And it's just in terms of what it is and who's going to do it, I think that is still not to be released to the public yet. But yeah, sure. I mean, I'd love to do a 2049 book. That would be, that would be an obvious project, and who knows, maybe I will. But I doubt if I will get the same level of cooperation that I received on the first one, because the first one was a combination of fortuitous circumstances, a nexus, if you will, of intersecting random threads that benefited everyone. And, I was there, and this time I wasn't, and by design. I mean, they wanted me there the first time. They didn't want anybody there the second time. So, and I don't say that as, as a sour grapes type of thing. That's just the way they decided to go. Now, I have to say, I think that hurt them. I think that there was a fundamental misstep in the marketing of that picture. And I'm talking as someone who was in marketing for years, decades. And, you're not supposed to, this is like, I suppose, being a cabinet member of the Trump administration. You're only supposed to say nice things about the guy in charge. But I think that the biggest misstep that they made was to not gradually acclimate a new generation of viewers to the original, where they could say, following in the tradition of, the classic. I mean, you didn't see any, reference to the original Blade Runner at all.
I know we talked for so long, but I just have to ask you about working on David Lynch's version of Dune.
Funny that Denis is now doing Dune again, but of course he's being very quiet about that too. So one assumes that a certain amount of the secrecy that was surrounding Blade Runner 2049 perhaps emanated from the director. I read Dune when it first came out in 1965 from an American publisher called Chilton Books, which at the time, only other kind of books they did were automotive manuals. This was their first fiction book. And Dune was such a nuclear payload on a fairly level landscape. This thing, had been so well researched and was so passionate about both the ecological destruction of our world and negative aspects of believing in messiahs, that it kind of melded this anti-religious attack on the whole idea of organized religion and fanaticism with a very, very concerned and informed voice regarding pollution and the destruction of the environment. Now, I'm 15 years old when I read this, and I'm just like, damn, this is whoa, I've never read anything like this. So now it's Frank Herbert. And of course, I read Children of Dune, Messiah of Dune as they came out. I was doing mainstream theatrical domestic publicity for a number of motion pictures for Universal at that point. And marketing had not really come into its fore. Publicity is where you sell something that is already existing. Marketing is when you're trying to sell something that has not really yet arrived. There's a distinction between the two. So marketing is now what is the primary method of sales in our modern society for entertainment. But back then it was publicity. So I was doing publicity for all kinds of different things. And Dune came up on the radar, and I said, oh, fuck me. I said, David Lynch? Oh, please, And I, of course, had seen The Elephant Man, and I'd seen Eraserhead, but I'd also seen at many underground screenings things like The Grandmother and The Alphabet and the short films that David had done when he was at AFI and on his own. So I was very familiar with his work. Of course, I knew about Dune, and I was the resident Universal Pictures resident science fiction guy. And so it became my project. And I started the in-house Dune fan club, where people, of course, the movie tanked, so that didn't go anywhere. But I also wrote, laid out, edited, and put together all the interviews for the Dune newsletter, which you may have seen, which came out at that time. It's kind of a collectible now, but we used to take them around to motion picture theaters all over the country and to science fiction conventions. I was giving, the dog and pony shows where I would go to like the World Science Fiction Convention or San Diego Comic-Con or things overseas. And then when they started production in Mexico City, I said, if this is my baby, I got to be on site. And I went down and I was in Mexico City while they were filming Dune. And I was actually a part of the production process. Now, Dune was an interesting project for me because for a number of reasons. The first time I'd seen a director openly admit that he had sold out. I remember riding with David when I first met him, riding with him to the studio from this place called La Zona Rosa, which is kind of the Beverly Hills of Mexico City, where they had put us all up in these varying hotels. And the transportation department was didn't have a lot of cars, so a couple of times I had to ride in with David. And I always felt awkward about that because I'm very mindful of other people's space. It doesn't seem like it sometimes because I'm rather enthusiastic and I'm very social and I can get wound up and people think I'm being overbearing, but I'm not. I'm just kind of effervescent, I guess. But David and I, the first time we met, he had this big cold sore on his lips. And I said, David, don't you know about lysine? And he looked at me and he said, what's lysine? And I said, well, it's an amino acid that they've just found out suppresses the virus that is nesting in the back of your brain that gets woken up by certain chemical combinations and causes oral herpes. And he just stared at me and he said, we're going to get along. Because David has a very empirical bent. His dad worked for the Department of Agriculture and, worked with plants and animals and, botany and biology. And David has this whole side to him that's very much like a botanist and a biologist. Anyway, but I knew about David, and a lot of the people that were working on that film had no idea. They just thought he was some nut. And David had this endearing candor about him. And I remember asking him maybe about 2 weeks into our relationship, well, how are you doing today? And he goes, I'm really depressed. And I go, why are you depressed? And he goes, because I'm at the head of the sellout line. And he walked away. And I went, uh-oh. And this was at the beginning of filming. And consequently, what I learned and what he told me and what others did was that he had gone in there to this as a challenge to see if he could do a mainstream big budget Hollywood epic and yet make it his film. But he had made the critical error of ceding Final Cut over to Dino De Laurentiis. And he liked Dino, but that was something that just he could not tolerate. And as it went on and on and on and on, because they were shooting for almost a year on that film, it was a massive production. I was there for most of that too. Certainly all phases of it, not every day, but certainly all critical phases of it, months on end. it was kind of dispiriting to see poor David, trying to, rally his enthusiasm and hope. He was never anything but professional and a lot of fun. David's a wonderful guy. Now he reminded me a bit of David Cronenberg. They're both very personable, genuine people who are big hearts. They have big hearts, and yet they are able to control and command a set. That's a very difficult balancing act, but they're good people. Again, like I said of Hampton, some people are just genuinely kind human beings. And both Davids are that way. But to watch Dune go through what it went through, it was a very trying production. And whereas in Blade Runner, I had been one step removed from the shitstorm of trauma and stress that everyone went through, Dune was my trial by fire, because I was in a position that was at that time fresh and unknown to many people within the business. And a lot of people didn't get what I was doing on that film. I also, if you go on, I don't know if you've seen Destination Dune, the short film that I directed, promotional, that's on YouTube. I was the only person who wound up actually getting a behind the scenes, well, there is one other one out there, but it's not really what I did. But that was something that I put into motion and had a crew down there shooting. I mean, they were doing other things, but I had a lot of trouble on that picture. And that was the picture where I woke up every morning saying, am I in the right profession? That was my Blade Runner. That was my Waterloo. That was my trial by fire. It was an excruciatingly difficult and horrible time for me. And then it came out and it bombed. So, and it really was a bomb, as opposed to Blade Runner, which is more cohesive artistically, I think. Dune certainly has some surreal and beautiful and wonderful moments, but it doesn't really all hang together. And it's because, David was not allowed to really shoot and cut together everything he wanted to. I also got to meet the Herberts on that, Frank and his wife, both who were ill at the time. No one really knew how ill, but alas, both of them, passed not too long after that. And but I got to sit down again with one of my heroes. I have been incredibly lucky. I've gotten to meet most of my heroes. Heroes, idols with feet of clay has sometimes been applicable, but many times I have felt this enormous flood of gratitude to be able to have had my small life intersect the shadow of giants.
Well, Frank seems like a hell of a nice guy, easygoing.
He was, yeah, that's what I just said. Yeah, he was like David, and they got along like a house on fire. They really liked each other. And Frank was very phlegmatic about the process. He was a big Dune booster. He said, "Hey, this is like a lot of people in the science fiction community being." There's always been this undercurrent of insularity in the varying genre communities. Fans have a tendency to count the number of buttons on Captain Kirk's tunic, and if they're off by a millimeter, then all hell, breaks loose. Frank was much more pragmatic about such things. He said, wow, look at this. I've got David Lynch, this incredibly talented director, and they're putting $60 million into this movie, and wow, and they've got this, it's being done seriously, and, they're doing the best they can in a novel that even I tried to, write a script for and couldn't crack. And he was great. He was very approachable. He was a guy who would take people out on camping trips and teach them, wilderness survivals and things like that. So he was a very down-to-earth guy. And Frank had a very bohemian life. He and his wife and kids had, there are a couple of biographies out there of Herbert, which I'm not going to recommend one over another, but there's one that Frank's son, and I've just blanked on his name, but did about their life, and it's spot on. And Frank Herbert had a very interesting life. He was a wanderer. He had wanderlust. He lived with his family in many different parts of the world and did many different things, and very grounded guy, and yet at the same time a passionate and committed activist artist. remember a very touching moment. There is a sequence in the final film that was mostly cut out where Kyle MacLachlan and Francesca Annis, playing Paul and the Lady Jessica, have just escaped the sandworm and first encounter the Fremen.
Wait, is this the scene where Paul cries after killing a Fremen in a duel?
Yes. Now, the behind-the-scenes story, and you may not know this, because I was standing there watching this. They're shooting in the middle of the night. That was in a location called the Red Eagles, or Las Aguilas Rojas, which was the Mexico City dump, the garbage area for Mexico City. So you can imagine Mexico City at that time, I think, had 10 or 11 million people. And the crew had gone in there and cleaned all the garbage out. And it was essentially red volcanic rock, which was razor sharp. And it had steam cleaned it with pressure hoses, but it all still smelled like garbage, which was very funny. But in that scene where he cries, Kyle could not come up with the tears. And Kyle kept trying and trying and trying. And he didn't want to go the route of the glycerin tears, where they either rub an onion under your face to get you to cry and then roll the camera, or else they just dab some of this glycerin compound to make it look like tears. He really wanted to. He was a serious young actor and still is. Kyle I like very much. Kyle was a nice guy too. A little awkward, a little certainly aware of the burden on his shoulders, but up to the task. I liked Kyle. Kyle was solid too. Anyway, I remember that finally he just, in the middle of the cut, just went off on a rage, just started screaming, and just like threw himself down on the ground and started to cry real tears of frustration. And I'll never forget David going, Kyle, and kneeling down and wrapping his arms around him and holding him while he was sobbing. Now, there you go. There's one you haven't heard before. That's how David was. The performers loved David. David had a very quirky way of directing, too. He was quite concise, though. I remember Everett McGill was the point where Lady Jessica grabs him around the throat and threatens him with a crysknife at the very first meeting, and essentially gets a drop on Everett McGill's character, Stilgar. And they were kind of like messing around, rehearsing it before they were shooting it. And Everett was really going over the top with it. And David, out of nowhere, he was laughing with them. And then out of the nowhere, he got real serious, and he just looked at him. He says, "That's fine." He says, "But dial it down to 4." And I thought, hey, there you go. You know, very, very, that's all you need to say. You know, it's there. Just pull back a bit, you know.
Actually, I recently interviewed Kenneth George Goodwin about his Dune experience.
Oh boy, yeah. What did he have to say?
Well, he talked about that he would have liked to get a hold of the material that was shot and make a sort of Hearts of Darkness type documentary on Dune, but the material seems to have been lost or just thrown in a dumpster at Universal Studios.
What happened was this. George and Anatole, who were the two guys who were shooting that crew. George was a sort of an academic or a proto-academic, a guy who had written a very, very insightful and very worthy analysis of Eraserhead, and had done it at a time when David Lynch's work was not getting that type of in-depth attention. And he had interviewed David, and David hit it off, and these things happen in show business. You're there at the right time, and you don't even know that you're there at the right time, and just because you have access, things happen. And so out of the blue, David said, well, look, you know, they were in the because I was involved at Universal, and this again was my baby, so I knew what was going on, and there had been some thought to do an EPK, electronic press kit. George was fortunate enough to have David say, well, you know, why don't you come down and we'll get a crew, and they're thinking about doing this, and you guys could do everything. Well, that turned into a comedy of errors for poor George and Anatole in many ways, because Universal was having trouble getting them the equipment. It was never, they were never really considered in-house to be important enough to give priority to. I kept lobbying. I was their cheerleader, and George, in essence, looked at me the same way that Philip K. Dick looked on Hampton Fancher when he first met him. George thought I was some kind of Hollywood hustler. And George thought that he had a privileged position and that he was in charge of the material. George thought he was working for David Lynch and did not realize he was working for Universal. And I kept trying to tell him, I said, yes, you've got this great relationship with David, and that's wonderful because you've got access. But the reality of this situation is you're working for Universal Pictures. And he never, and I was the representative in his world of Universal Pictures. And so I would come down and I would say, look, okay, guys, you're doing a great job, but I need this, this, and this. And I would get resistance. And I had a terrible relationship with George. George has called me an asshole in public. And maybe I am, but I think that there are a few people who I've worked with that might beg to differ. The way I'm talking to you now is no different than the way I talked to George Godwin, 30 years ago. I'd already had about 10 years of, like hard knocks. And I was still learning, but I was working within the studio. And I kept trying to be the good guy that would go in there and say, look, I need, I'm your buffer. No. You just care about yourself. You just care about the studio. No, I care about you guys, because I got to work with you. Why would I cut my nose off to spite my face? It makes no sense. But anyway, that was, for whatever reason, that relationship was fraught. And then all the tapes came back. And because the film already was starting to bring in negative reactions, Universal just said, well, this is never going to fly. Take all those masters and just black them. It's called blacking them. And they just erased everything so they could use the stock. I had nothing to do with that. In fact, I was the person that let them know. It was probably a mistake. But, I was shattered. A guy who writes a book like Feature and Raw certainly sees the importance of the historical record. And, and so I was the guy that was always saying, well, to Gordon Armstrong, who was both my boss and their boss, although they never really accepted the fact that Gordon was their boss. I kept saying, look, let's put this aside. This is really important. Okay, we will. And then I went looking for it, and I found out that they had just arbitrarily decided to save money and reuse the, cassettes. And that is so studio. They still do that. The past assets never have meant very much to motion picture studios. I mean, now there are so few things that are, on durable archival mediums. I mean, everything is on the cloud or on hard drives. Well, yeah, but, that's all just ones and zeros. Where's the actual physical artifact, like a print? That you can put aside, that you can put into a vault, and it's going to be there if you take care of it 100 years from now. Whereas if you just have everything in the cloud, or if you've got it on a hard drive, I remember when they burned all the stuff from Alien, all the props. Burned all the props from Alien. The reason being is because the FBI was investigating people like Roddy McDowall back in the 1980s about what they thought of as piracy. And Roddy McDowall was one of the greatest film buff collectors in the world. And he had hundreds of prints of stuff. And he wasn't making money off of them. He was doing what the studio should have done. He was being an archivist. And he was hauled into court. Saying, oh, you're ripping off. And the studios freaked out. And they said, oh, my God, we better make sure that nobody rips us off. And one of the ways is we'll take all the props that we've got in storage and burn them. It's what? But also they had a lot of trouble with labs and equipment. And there was let's just say it was an unfortunate thing all around. I hold no ill will towards George all these years later. I tried to get through, and I just didn't. And so I just went, well, if that's the way you're going to be. But I hope perhaps now George understands a bit more about the business. And, I wish nothing but the best for George, even though he's called me an asshole.
But you wrote an article about Dune that came out in Cinefantastique.
Yeah, that's my Dune diary, which incidentally is not my Dune diary. That's a story in and of itself. It was rewritten by the people at Cinefantastique, about 30%, because I was candid about the trials and tribulations that I was undergoing, and they said, "Oh, nobody wants to read about the problems that are going on, and we want to make this like a like a real happy, rosy picture." And I said, "What?" And also the fact that there was a embargo on certain images, and here's a good story. I spent all this time on Dune, and I'm in charge of a lot of the publicity for it. And I opened up this Cinefantastique thing, and in my article with my name on it are pictures that were never supposed to be printed at that time. And what had happened was the editor and publisher of that publication, Fred Clark, who was known for doing this kind of thing, had gone behind my back and paid someone in the Dune production under the table to surreptitiously ship them photos. And he never told me that they were going to be put into my article. And then I read it, and I went, "Oh my fucking Christ!" And so I never worked for them again. And it was a very, I mean, I was a subscriber, and I loved the magazine, but I would never work for them. It was just a horrible betrayal of trust.
But you still have your original text.
Yes, I do. I've been sitting on it. One of these days I will release it.
So what would it take for you to have it published again?
Maybe a decent publisher. But no, it's not anything. It's just more, the tone is different, and also there were some things that were cut, and it was a shock. It was my most, again, as I said, that overall the Dune experience to me was my trial by fire. So many things were so awful for me on that, but live and learn. I mean, that was the one where I learned some things that came in handy later down the line. A lot of sleepless nights and tears shed on that project. But there you go. And believe me, my stress level was nothing compared to poor David Lynch. That poor guy. Jesus. And then look what happens. Oh, and of course, the great irony is that 2 years later, both of us, I was working for DEG and I worked on Blue Velvet. And I was the one that brought Blue Velvet to Chicago to show to Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel because the studio was going to bury it. Blue Velvet, they didn't know what to do with it in terms of marketing. I said, I know what to do. And so I brought it out to regular film festivals, and I brought it out to science fiction, fantasy, and horror festivals, and I brought it out to Siskel and Ebert so they could see it on at the movies, the show did. So it was funny because David walked past me and he goes, "You again?" I go, "Yeah, hi." And that after I'd been told by someone close to the Dune production that I'd never work in this town again. And 2 years later, I'm not only working on it, but I'm working for more money on another David Lynch movie.
Som sagt, vi kunde pratat hur länge som helst. Och jag hann inte ens gå in på hans Conan och Robocop-inspelningshistorier. Så att vi får nöja så här helt enkelt och hoppas att ni tyckte det var roligt. Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då!